All righty. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Victoria Williams. I'm a program officer here at the Chicago Council. We welcome you to tonight's program called Ransom, Payment versus Principle. It's a pleasure to welcome Joel Simon and Clarence Page to the Council. Joel's new book, We Want to Negotiate the Secret World of Kidnapping, Hostages, and Ransom, will be available for sale and signing after the program from our partners, the bookseller. Please note that we are on the record and we are live streaming this event. We always welcome your social media engagement, but please silence your phones. Note that the Council is an independent and nonpartisan platform, and views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. Thank you to our members in attendance today. Your support is critical to our work. If you are not yet a member, we hope you consider joining us. We have a wide range of levels for you to choose from. If you are going to our cocktails and conversation mixer after the program, please note that it is taking place at Free Reign, which is at the St. Jane Hotel, formerly known as the Hard Rock Hotel on Michigan Avenue. The information is also listed on our screens. Tonight's program will be followed by audience Q&A. We will be taking the questions from in the room and from online. If you want to submit your question online, you can submit it at chi.cnf.io, and you can just open up your browser to submit that. But now I'd like to introduce our speakers for this evening. Joel Simon, he is the Executive Director of the Committee to Protect Journalists. He has led numerous international missions to advance press freedom and was involved in trying to raise ransom to free American journalist James Foley. Prior to joining the committee in 1997, Joel has worked for a decade as a freelance journalist in Latin America, covering the Civil War, in Guatemala, economic turmoil in Cuba, and following the collapse of the Soviet Union, among other major events in the world. And moderating our conversation is Clarence Page. Clarence is a columnist, and he is recognized by the Tribune Media Services, and also is a member of the board at the Chicago Tribune. He is a 1989 Pulitzer Prize winner for commentary and was inducted into the Chicago Journalism Hall of Fame in 1992. He's a frequent panelist on Hardball with Chris Matthews, NPR, and Black Entertainment Television. Clarence also serves on the board of Committee to Protect Journalists. So with that, I will return to moderate audience Q&A, but please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Victoria. Thank you. We can't go on meeting like this, Joel.
Absolutely.
My goodness. I've known Joel for about 20 years now, something like that. He's been a fantastic director for the Committee to Protect Journalists, and it's been, we've been at such fun spots as Yemen and
it was Zimbabwe, Mozambique. We made trouble all over the world.
Who could forget Zimbabwe? You know, it was really. Anyway, I got a pardon me. I was just telling Joel I'm at the stage of life what Benjamin Disraeli called my anecdotage. You know, I'm just telling stories all the time. You've got some great stories to tell, some very important stories to tell in this book. And I'd like to just start this discussion, really, for folks who aren't familiar with our organization, to just say a couple words about what the Committee to Protect Journalists does to protect journalists. And the way the headlines have been the last few years, I often think maybe we ought to change it to the Committee trying to protect journalists.
It's rough out there. Absolutely. Well, basically, the CPJ, we're as you know, Clarence, we're an organization of journalists, and Clarence is a member of our board of directors, but there are other very recognizable names, people who are some of the best journalists in this country and around the world, but are also committed to the defense of their colleagues. And what CPJ does is we use the tools of journalism to defend our colleagues around the world who are working in environments of violence and repression. And we're like, almost in some ways, we're like a news service that covers the press freedom beat. And whenever a journalist is thrown in jail or a journalist is attacked or God forbid killed or kidnapped, we're going to be talking about that. You know, we are on it. We document it. We write about it. We put out statements. We engage with governments. We produce reports. And we're also keeping journalists safe. We're providing them with safety information. We're responding when they're put in jail and their families need support. So we're providing a variety of advocacy and assistance focused on our central mission, which is to ensure that journalists around the world are able to work safely without fear of reprisal.
Indeed, and it led to this book in the most tragic sort of way, but very important questions were raised. I'll let you tell the story, because it goes right back to Chicago and the James Foley, Evanston lad, a Medill graduate, and at age 40 died on duty here covering Syria. And I'll let you tell the story about how you met the Foley family.
Well, I think the important thing to keep in mind is that I've been doing this job for a long time. I was a journalist in Latin America before I became started at CPJ. So kidnapping is an occupational hazard for journalists. I mean, there are certain attributes of the profession that we practice, particularly when you're working in conflict environments, that expose us to risk. I mean, journalists, first of all, they have to go to these dangerous places to do their job when you're covering conflict. You can't surround yourself with armed guards because you have to talk to people. And if you're surrounded by armed guards, you're not able to do that. And you have to put your trust in people. I mean, because your job is to sit down and hear about their concerns and convey those concerns, listen to all sides. And so, it's an occupational hazard for journalists. And I've had to deal with this situation in many different circumstances. Some of you may remember Daniel Pearl, for example, the Wall Street Journal reporter who was kidnapped by al-Qaeda in Pakistan right after 9/11. He was eventually killed. And in fact, after that, we saw really, because his murder just sent a signal to jihadi groups all over the world that journalists were fair game.
That's kind of a turning point, wasn't it?
Yeah, and we really saw the risk increase. Partly it had to do with the technology and the fact that journalists, even if you were a bad guy, if you wanted to communicate with the public, you had to talk to the press. Suddenly that changed. You had other ways of communicating. But as bad as it was, we'd never seen anything like what happened in Syria. And so Jim Foley disappeared actually on Thanksgiving Day in 2012. And then over the course of the next several months, there were a spate of journalists and others in Syria. We knew that there was some mysterious group out there that was targeting Westerners. We didn't know who they were, what their motive was, because they were simply disappearing. And it wasn't until about a year after he was taken that the family heard from the kidnappers. And the title of my book, We Want to Negotiate, is actually the message that the Foley family and his editors received from the kidnappers. And one of the things that I look at in the book is the United States has this policy of, when you're kidnapped by a terrorist organization, we don't negotiate, and we don't really, it's technically illegal even to pay the ransom. And so the family was just really on their own. They really didn't get this kind of support that they would have expected from the U.S. government. And at some point, they decided they were going to try and raise the ransom. It wasn't really clear whether there was even really an opportunity to do so. But they thought, what else? What choice did they have? So they came to me and they asked for my help. And I had met Jim, I knew him a little bit, and some people on our staff were really close to him. And of course, my job is to protect journalists, so of course I was going to do everything I could. But after things ended as terribly as they did, I had a heart-to-heart talk with Jim's mother, Diane, about and she actually said to me, actually, Joel, I thought you could have done more. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, you gave us a little help, but maybe you could have done more to help us in this circumstance. And I kind of explained, well, look, I was concerned about the legal jeopardy I might face. This was at that point we knew it was the Islamic State. They were a terrorist organization. It was illegal to pay ransom to them. I was concerned about the legal jeopardy my organization might face. And I was also concerned that paying ransom, even on behalf of one journalist who we obviously wanted to bring home, might make it more dangerous for other journalists because it would encourage more kidnapping. And Diane said to me, she said, well, everyone assumes that, but do you really know it to be true? And I said, Diane, it's logical, but I don't know it to be true. And I sort of thought, well, I'm a journalist. This is a difficult question. No one's really looking deeply at it. I should use the skills that I have as a journalist to explore this. And Clarence, that's how the book came about.
I have to say, as all great stories start with a question.
Yeah.
And that's the key question that just stopped me in my tracks because we've all, any of us who are old enough, been around enough, have seen this sort of a drama unfold repeatedly over the last few decades. And really, well, going back to Richard Nixon in particular, the idea of not negotiating with terrorists, you gave me some new enlightenment about that. But that question is one that, well, now we've seen enough that we've got some statistics now. We can see what works and what doesn't in various hostage situations and ransom situations. Well, let me go back to Nixon for my next question. Why was that important?
Well, I mean, so
and Sirhan.
Yeah, well, it's a very logical assumption. Where this is a logical thing. If you pay ransom, more people are going to be kidnapped, and we don't negotiate with terrorists. Should be a deterrent. So, I sort of started. I didn't know this when I started the research for the book, but I started asking around. Where did that policy come from? I actually heard different things, but finally I talked to somebody who was involved in the formulation of the policy, and he told me what had happened was, in the 1960s, there was a series of kidnappings of diplomats, mostly American diplomats and European diplomats in Latin America, carried out by leftist groups. And the U.S. government commissioned this study. They asked the RAND Corporation, which is this think tank in Santa Monica that does a lot of security-related research for the U.S. government, to assess how the U.S. should respond to this. And they were in the middle of kind of looking at different scenarios and how best to respond when there was another kidnapping incident which took place in Khartoum, Sudan, and it involved a Palestinian terrorist group who took over the Saudi embassy in Khartoum and took a whole bunch of diplomats hostage, including a couple of U.S. diplomats. And one of their demands was for the release of Sirhan Sirhan, the convicted murderer Robert F. Kennedy, who was the opponent of Richard Nixon in the presidential campaign. And the next morning, as it happened, after this kidnapping took place, Nixon had a press conference. And he was asked by a journalist at the press conference, how do you intend to respond to this demand? And of course, he's not going to release Sirhan. So he said, we're not going to give in to blackmail. We can't negotiate with terrorists. It was a logical response, but what happened was that when the word reached the kidnappers back in Khartoum, they actually took the American diplomats down in the basement and shot them and killed them. And so the person who was involved in the formulation of this policy said at that point it became a policy written in blood. It had sort of cost the lives of these Americans, and when this person presented their findings, his name is Brian Jenkins, to Henry Kissinger and said, actually when we look at the research, it doesn't really seem to matter much what your policy is, whether you negotiate or not. It's kind of a crime of opportunity. Kissinger was not really in the mood to hear that. And so, it was sort of hardened into policy after that. There was a national security directive that was ratified. It was developed in the Bush administration, actually adopted in the Clinton administration. It was reaffirmed in the Obama administration, and it remains our policy today. But what I found, also there have been more recent studies which have sort of concluded the same thing. There isn't a big correlation between kidnapping of citizens that refuse to negotiate and those that pay ransom. They seem to be kidnapped in the same numbers. And the reason seems to be it's largely a crime of opportunity. Once there's a market for kidnapping, and there always is a market because families will pay and businesses will pay and some governments will pay, at that point it's more opportunistic. Where the research is pretty conclusive in terms of the correlation is countries that pay, the people are released and they come home alive, and countries that don't pay, they tend to be killed. To give a range, Spain, one of the countries that I looked at, has about 100% recovery for Spanish citizens who are kidnapped by terrorist groups. The U.S., it's about 25%. So the difference there, you could say, is sort of the cost of this policy. Only 25% of Americans kidnapped by terrorist groups come out alive, according to the data.
Yeah, when I saw that Nixon story, I thought about the old saying about doing something over and over again. It doesn't work, and you still keep doing it. That kind of started there, really, with that policy. Did not turn out well, but yet it became standard. I think people still think.
Again, I think there are reasons for it that make sense. One is it is a lot of these things. Also, the other thing I found about is that the policy is driven by the politics. And when you are leading, when you're leading a country that's engaged in military actions, and you have security interests around the world, you want to be able to resist groups that you are engaging with that want to use this coercive strategy. You want to be able to tell them it's not going to work. Certainly, that's a reasonable impulse, and it also, it's logical. It's logical that if you don't pay, then you undermine the economic logic of the crime. The problem is that, there are so many, but again, once the market exists, once the kidnappers perceive that there's some advantage, whether it's a political advantage or an economic advantage, then it's very hard to undermine the logic. So a security consultant I talked to compared it to, because the overall premise is that if no one paid, there'd be no kidnapping. And somebody pointed out, well, if nobody ever gave their wallet to a mugger, there'd be no mugging. But that just is not the way it works.
How do you get from here to there?
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Yeah, well, I noticed that, policy-wise, there are some countries that don't negotiate, like us and the UK. There are some that always negotiate and always pay, like Spain.
Yes.
And would you put Italy in that category?
Italy is in that category.
And then you've got some like France that say we won't negotiate, but they secretly do, and pay ransom. Yeah.
So when I started the book, I started with France because I assumed that France was the country that was sort of known for being the most ready to negotiate. And why is this? It's because when French citizens are taken hostage, certain citizens, like journalists and aid workers and sort of prominent French people who are working overseas, and the French perceive them have a legitimate purpose in doing so, there's this like mass political mobilization, and people come into the streets, and there are signs, and there's a lot of campaigns, and then there's a kind of ritual where the president expresses concern and sort of encourages the mobilization, and then when they're finally released, they meet them at the airport and they talk about the sacrifices the country made, and
it's a big media event.
Yeah, they speak in code, but they officially deny that ransom is paid. So I assumed that sort of France was the country that was most likely to pay. But the reality is that it's a complex political calculation in France. There's a political culture in France around mobilization. And there's an expectation among French citizens that the state will respond to these kinds of demands, particularly when they involve attacks on French people overseas. This is sort of part of the colonial legacy, and it's also a kind of conception that France's soft power is derived from its ability to kind of extend cultural influence around the world, and it can't do that if the people who are working in these environments don't have the support of the state. So it's really a political calculation. What that means is that if you can get people into the street, if you can make this into a big deal, if you can put pressure on the government, then the government will engage with the kidnappers and will try to bring you home alive, and usually that means money. And I talked to a former hostage, a journalist named Florence Abenon, and she had been freed from her captivity in Iraq, where she was kidnapped in 2004 because there was this mass protest, and the government eventually won her freedom. And then after that, she decided that she had a responsibility to other French citizens to lead protests on their behalf. And the reason, and she leads these support committees, and they're very effective. And she gives the government a hard time, and some people criticize this because it is effective in terms of bringing people home, but it's fairly likely that it increases the cost. Because the more visible the hostage is, the more valuable they are, and the more you have to pay. So that's the dynamic in France. And then I went to Spain because I saw this data point that Spain had a 100% recovery rate. And I talked to the head of Spanish intelligence. I actually sort of have a chapter about that discussion. And he didn't officially admit anything, but he sort of said, look, it's kind of a political decision, and the political directive that I've gotten from the president and several administrations is we bring Spanish hostages home. We do what we need to do. And once that that framework is in place, as one person said, we don't need to protest. We don't need to protest because we know the government is going to do what they need to do. So that's the kind of the economy. You go from Spain and Italy, I think, which are most willing to engage and to pay, to France, where it's more of a political calculation, to the U.S. and the U.K., which have this no concessions framework and are pretty strict about applying it.
Mm. Now, you and CPJ weren't the only folks who were gently chastised by James Foley's mom.
Mm-hmm.
President Obama was too.
Yeah.
And you also recently did an interesting piece in the LA Times about President Trump's policy regarding hostages and ransom. Have we learned anything? What's changed between the Obama administration and the Trump administration?
Well, yes, I think so. So what happened? What happened in the, after the terrible outcome in Syria, and basically what happened was that of a chapter, looking at this group of hostages that were taken by the Islamic State. Some were European, and some were from the U.S. and some were from the U.K. And in the end, all of the European hostages came home alive. Millions of dollars in ransom were paid, and the Americans and the British hostages were killed. And this produced a reckoning. And for the American families, they just felt they were in an impossible situation. I mean, I should point out some of the paradoxes in the U.S. policy. So, for example, if you were kidnapped by a member of the Mexican drug cartel, that's considered a criminal group, and it's legal to pay a ransom to the Mexican drug cartels, and the FBI will support you. They may even deliver the ransom. I should point out that if you happen to be kidnapped in the United States, the preferred strategy, it's a rare crime in this country because it's a very hard crime to get away with, so the preferred strategy that the FBI uses is something called ransom as lure, and what that means is they have money stashed throughout the country. They will actually provide money from the U.S. Treasury to pay the ransom. They will pay the ransom, they will free you, and then they will go after the kidnappers, and they always get the kidnappers because it's really hard to get away with this crime. And so there's this tremendous disincentive to kidnapping really isn't a crime here, but they get their people. But if you are kidnapped by a terror organization outside the United States, it is illegal to pay the ransom. The FBI certainly will not help you. They might turn a blind eye, but in the case of the Foley family, they were threatened that they could be prosecuted for paying a ransom. At a certain point, they didn't care. Their son's life was on the line. They're like, put me in jail. But it made it harder for them to go out and raise the money that they wanted to raise to try and pay this ransom. And they were just sent from one agency to the next. They couldn't get a straight answer. They were treated really poorly. So and the other American families in this position had the same experience. So after the terrible outcome, Diane Foley, I have a chapter in my book about her. She's just a remarkable woman.
She sounds like
oh man,
she really does.
Yeah, she some person I talked to said, Diane gets what she wants, and she really wanted. She had this meeting with Obama. I mean, this is to give you a sense of what she's like, and Obama said to her, she couldn't get a meeting with him while her son was held captive, and that angered her a great deal. But she finally got a meeting after he was killed, and the president said to her, he said, Diane, Jim was always our first priority, and she said, Mr. President, that wasn't true. And,
boom.
And he acknowledged, he said, yeah, we have to do better. And to his credit, he ordered a hostage policy review. And they looked at the policy from top to bottom. But the one thing they took off the table was this no concessions framework. They were not going to look at that. The U.S. policy would be no concessions. That wasn't going to change. But they brought together all the different agencies involved in hostage response. They created what's called a hostage recovery fusion cell, combines FBI and State Department, brings in intelligence. They created a new position in the State Department. They softened the policy a little bit so that the U.S. government couldn't negotiate, but they could communicate with hostage takers. President Obama stood up and affirmed, he said, look, this is against the law, but I want to make clear we've never actually prosecuted families for paying ransom. So there has been some.
That's not what they told Mrs. Foley before.
Well, no,
was it?
well, they threatened her. I mean, the thing was, there wasn't a consistent. She was getting different messages.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, and it is against the law. And you have to remember this moment how Americans felt. You know, we were terrorized by this group, and so people who thought, okay, well, I'm going to help them. They were really concerned about what might happen to them. So the structure for responding to hostage incidents is much better, but the policy remains the same. The one thing that was also interesting in my book, I talked to the person in the Trump administration who took over the portfolio, and he told me, you know, there was a handoff, and every handoff between Obama and Trump was completely dysfunctional, except for this one. The person in charge, the policies remained in place. It's largely consistent. And the person who took over the portfolio said there's like nothing Obama did that we agree with, except this was kind of okay.
And that included the no negotiation,
yeah,
no concession.
And Trump actually. So I mean, I think what makes this issue so interesting and difficult is, you know, it's a problem from hell. There's no right answer, and the reason Obama struggled with this is that he was legitimately concerned with the strategic challenges around this issue. You know, if you pay ransom, you know, in his view, you're financing terror groups, and he was fighting against these terror groups. And so that worked.
In fact, that was his real priority.
Yeah, that was his real priority.
He was saying James Foley.
Yeah, and the policy was to try and create a global no concessions framework to get every country around the world to agree not to pay ransom. The British were on board with this. The Americans. I talked to the person in the Treasury Department who was kind of in charge of trying to create this global consensus. It ultimately didn't work, but that was the approach. And I think in doing this, he kind of lost track of the human dimensions of the problem. You know, that these are real people, and they're suffering, and they need support, and they need to know that their government has their back and is looking for creative solutions and not just threatening to prosecute them or telling them that this is the policy. And they didn't have that. And I think I think Obama thought it was cheap, you know, because there is a political benefit to bringing a hostage home, but I think Obama, you know, thought that was cheap. And I think Trump understands that benefit and is not really terribly concerned about the strategic consequences. So it's, you know, so he does, the Trump administration, the families that I talk to say, you know, they actually are able to engage with the Trump administration on this issue, not so much hostages taken by terrorist groups, but Americans unjustly held and imprisoned by governments around the world. Trump has a pretty good record of bringing those folks home. He's quite proud of it. It's part of his anti-Obama obsession because he believes Obama, you know, kind of just sort of failed in this area, and he's going to succeed. But it's worth acknowledging that the families themselves say they are having, you know, good engagement from the Trump administration.
And they sort of know how to make the families feel like somebody cares about them, somebody's talking to them, keeping them in touch.
That is so important. And I even think, even though the British have just as firm a no concessions policy, maybe even stricter, they have a much more, they have a better sort of human touch. You know, when British families are the victims of these kinds of crimes, you know, they're immediately, you know, top Scotland Yard and intelligence officials will show up at their house. They'll help help the family deal with this. They'll bring them to London. They have this little kind of safe house where they keep them. They'll get a meeting with the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister might say, you know, look, we don't negotiate. That's British policy, but I want to tell you we're doing everything. So there's more of a human touch, even if the policy is firm. I think the U.S. under the Obama administration lacked both the human touch and a strict adherence to this policy, and I think that's what really made the families feel that, you know, they were just bereft.
Mm-hmm. And also, spoiler alert, near the end of your book, you mentioned in rather diplomatic terms that President Trump has not allowed himself to be overly burdened by actual knowledge.
Well, yeah, the thing is, you know, basically, you know, where I sort of come down on this whole issue is, you know, and this is my experience at the Committee to Protect Journalists dealing with these kinds of situations. You know, each case is different. You know, each case is different, and that, you know, if you think about the kinds of strategies that will bring a hostage home, you know, but the only thing that both sides agree on in a hostage negotiation is that the value of the hostage is derived from the fact that they're alive. So keeping them alive, that's it. You know, there are different reasons for keeping them alive, but that's kind of the basis of the negotiation and how you build trust. So if you think about the opening gambit as, we won't negotiate and we're not going to pay. I mean, if you're a family in a position like that, that would never be your opening gambit, right? You would always want to, so you don't want to announce that. I mean, I think you want to, you may or may not choose to pay. It depends on the circumstances. But there's really no advantage other than like a political advantage in announcing your intention. So I think I think the ideal approach is one that's more flexible, looks at through the lens of national security, because you can't just pay willy-nilly, but looks for creative strategies that could achieve the objective of supporting the families, bringing these folks home, in the context of the legitimate national security considerations. I think there's a lot more creative room to achieve that. And I think that if Obama was hamstrung, as I said, by the strategic considerations, Trump has kind of been different to them. If you're making these complex decisions, you need knowledge. You need to understand the strategic consequences. And the State Department's obviously been gutted under Trump, the national security infrastructure. So, I worry.
All the people that are the foot soldiers who bring you the information of what's going on in the world.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm. Well, that is well, he does appreciate simplicity.
Yes.
Which works in campaigns, no question about that. But your book is told in stories to a large degree, which is wonderful. We get to experience some of these issues through the people who actually live with them and all. The most fascinating surprise for me was the insurance broker, Kidnapping Insurance and all. Just reminded me of a Russell Crowe movie. Some of you may have seen there, A Proof of Life. Although Russell Crowe was more of a private eye, like a freelance negotiator.
Yeah, well, that's part of the insurance industry.
That's part of the industry. Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, that's something that is I was aware of it, but I really explored it in the book. So there's something called Kidnapping and Ransom Insurance, which K&R. Most people have never heard of it, but if you were in a high-risk profession, you may know about it. And basically, it was developed as a product, in the 1960s in Europe, where leftist groups were targeting wealthy Europeans, and so the Europeans who were kidnapped by these groups were doubly victimized. First, they were victimized by the kidnapping themselves, and then after they paid the ransom, these families, might be destroyed financially. So they came up with this product, and basically, the way the insurance worked is, after you paid, you could only be insured for your net assets, and after you paid, you would be reimbursed. So the idea was it wouldn't inflate the amount that was paid, and the negotiation was credible because you still had to sell your house and raise the assets, and that's important because if the negotiation itself isn't credible, then sometimes the kidnappers come back. It's called a double dip, and they're like, well, that was easy. You gave us that money so quickly. We obviously didn't want to ask for enough, so we need more. So you have to make sure you actually have to drag out the negotiation, and they have to be convinced that they've reached, the limit of what you can pay. So this product was then became popular in Europe, and I talked to this insurance broker named Doug Milne, who was looking for new markets, and he went to Colombia, South America, where there was this kidnapping epidemic carried out by the leftist guerrillas there, and also the drug cartels. He had a very successful business selling insurance to wealthy Colombians. And then in the 1980s, they added this new feature to the policy, which was a professional negotiator. So if you were kidnapped, you would not only have this policy, but they would send a professional negotiator to help negotiate the ransom. And these folks became very experienced and very adept at these kinds of negotiations. They can pretty well say, well, you're kidnapped by X group. It usually takes this amount of time. The ransom is usually X. Sometimes they have a relationship with these groups that they built over time. Strangely enough, there's a certain level of trust. So these negotiators are absolutely vital. And this insurance has become very widespread. One of the features of this insurance is the person who's insured is not supposed to know that they're insured because they don't want the person who's kidnapped negotiating directly. So you're not supposed to be informed. It could even be invalidated if the person who's insured actually finds out about it. If you're a company, you don't announce to your employees that you have this insurance.
So my editor could have a policy on me if I'm covering a danger zone.
I don't know for sure, but I would bet they do. It's pretty. It's
You have a lot of faith,
for
Joel.
news.
Thank you.
Well, I don't know. For news organizations, it's not uncommon, and frankly, it's they have an obligation, in my view. It's a sort of what's called duty of care. If you're expecting people to undertake risks, particularly in the journalism world, I think a responsible news organization has this insurance, even if they never tell their employees, which in fact they're not supposed to. But one of the things about this insurance that happened after 9/11, when there was the introduction of the Patriot Act, which criminalized financing of terror groups, it actually made it illegal to pay ransom under these insurance policies to designated terrorist groups. And that's where this carve-out started between criminal groups, which you can pay legally, and terror groups, which you cannot. So if you are kidnapped by a criminal group, you will have a professional negotiator, your policy will be valid, you'll be reimbursed. If you're kidnapped by a terror group, it's a gray area. Maybe you can get a professional negotiator to help, but you will not be reimbursed for the ransom if you can even raise it. So that's a real limitation, and the people I talk to in the industry, they understand why that carve-out exists, but it strikes them as arbitrary, and sometimes strikes the family as arbitrary, because you can imagine, you're kidnapped and you've activated your policy, and you're like, okay, the worst has happened, but at least I'm going to have the support. And then they say, I'm sorry, but we've determined that your child is kidnapped by Al-Qaeda. We can only help you in limited ways, and if you pay, you're not going to be reimbursed.
But if they're kidnapped by MS-13, then we can negotiate.
Yeah, absolutely. You can negotiate. You'll be reimbursed. And some of these so-called criminal organizations are terrorizing criminal organizations. They're drug cartels. The Mexican drug cartels, in their behavior, are not that different from the Islamic State. They're doing these, they're terrorizing whole communities. They're using these terrorizing videos to sow fear. They're causing whole-scale disruption of these whole communities. So the money that goes to these groups will be used for terrible purposes. I think the argument that the harm committed by criminal groups is somehow less than the harm committed by designated terrorist groups, that really is difficult to sustain.
Yeah, I was going to say, this is another consideration here, that the difference between a terror group and a criminal gang is that your ransom money is probably going to be used to possibly kill other Americans, or kill military targets or civilian targets, whatever.
That's the most complex and a difficult part of the argument. I think the argument that not paying keeps Americans safer is difficult to sustain. But the argument that this money is used to finance terror groups, that is indisputable. There was a New York Times investigation carried out by a reporter, Rukmini Callimachi, who's one of the great reporters on Islamic terrorism and jihadi groups, and she estimated that $120 million in ransom money had gone to Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, the group that operated in North Africa, and that money had been used to, mostly paid by Europeans, to finance terror operations around the world. So that is an absolutely legitimate concern. So then the question becomes, how do you stop that, or how do you reduce that? That amount of money flowing to those terror groups. Can you do it by making it, by criminalizing the payment of ransom? That just didn't seem to work. It's a good idea, right? Because you want to stop the financing, but families will pay, businesses will pay, some governments will pay. And there isn't trust between the governments that do pay and the governments that don't, so they're not sharing intelligence. There is a really good cooperation. And the other thing, ironically, is I believe that in some circumstances it can actually increase the amount of money going to terror groups. There's actually a communication from Osama bin Laden to the leaders of the Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb in North Africa, in which he said, they were asking him for advice about negotiations, and he said, well, kill the least valuable hostage. And of course that's going to be an American or a Brit, because they don't have value. And when you kill a hostage, you achieve a certain political objective, and you put more pressure on those who will pay, so the amount goes up. So in some circumstances, this strategy, I believe, even in terms of that objective, reducing the amount of money flowing to terrorist organizations can be subverted. So, I mean, I don't, there's no easy
and
answer.
There can also be an intelligence value to saving your hostages, because you can learn things from them.
It's a huge so I mean, all the Europeans I talk to are like, look, yes, we they don't admit this, or some of the analysts who are on the sidelines who will sort of defend it. But look, they're gathering intelligence all the time. Sometimes they pay, like the FBI. It's they see it as ransom as lure. They get their people out, but they get the intelligence they need to go after them. That does happen. I think a lot of times, sadly, the groups get away with it. But I mean, my view is like, again, to reframe the objective, the shared objective, which is to bring people home alive and pay as little as possible. Right, and if you share that and acknowledge that people will pay, there's no scenario in which people won't pay. The experts I talked to said, look, the thing that stops kidnapping, if you look at where there have been surges in kidnapping around the world, in Colombia, in Peru when Sendero Luminoso was a threat there, in Lebanon, when Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad were carrying out kidnapping as part of their sort of arsenal of weapons that they used in that conflict. So kidnapping is a tactic in any conflict. It simply exists, and what stops kidnapping is somehow resolving the conflict. How you behave in the context of the conflict, it's like saying, we're at war and we're at war with car bombing. No, you're not at war with car bombing. Car bombing is a tactic that exists where there's conflict. So, there are lots of ways of resolving a conflict. You can negotiate a settlement. As happened, there's a peace agreement in Colombia. Kidnapping is really basically radically diminished. The conflict in Lebanon wound down. There is no kidnapping in Lebanon. Sometimes there is, but it's at a tolerable level.
I was hate to say there is no kidnapping.
No, there obviously is. That's I didn't mean there is, but it's not at epidemic levels. You also had a spike in kidnapping in Somalia and piracy. They were able to come up with strategies to provide greater security, so that that threat is diminished. Peru, there was essentially a military defeat of Sendero Luminoso. So, where you have active conflict, you will have kidnapping. It is a tactic. To treat it as a sort of separate tactic that can be combated outside the broader context of the conflict itself, there isn't really a lot of evidence that that's a successful strategy.
Has there been, as far as you can tell, a decline in kidnapping with the Islamic states as they've been sort of on the road now?
Yeah,
absolutely.
On the run? So that's the other thing I found is kidnapping comes in waves. Where there's active conflict and where there are groups that can control territory, you see kidnapping. So, there have been cycles. And I think actually we're in a little bit of a lull because the Islamic State, which was, and while Al-Qaeda and the Taliban still engage in this tactic, it's somewhat diminished because they have control, certainly in the case of Al-Qaeda, less territory. So I mean, from the vantage point of this discussion, I think this is a good time to talk about what we should do, what our policies should be, because this will always come back. It comes back. Sometimes it returns in an even more brutal form. And it's very hard to have this discussion when there are active cases, because it's such an emotional issue. So I think it's a good time to sort of think about these issues in a critical way. That's sort of my objective. But to recognize that it's never going to go away. Right now maybe we're not dealing with it in the same way, but it will return.
Yeah, I was wondering, in fact, if the fact that we seem to be in kind of a lull, if that's the kind of time when people don't want to think about it. We tend to care more when there's a crisis going on.
Yeah, I mean, people think about it in a different way. I mean, people. I think, So I've been obviously just wrote this book, and I've been out talking to people and sort of engaging, and I found like people they're very thoughtful about it because it's a genuine dilemma, and there are powerful arguments on both sides. And I think it's one of those things that people talk about. People who've lived with this reality obviously have strong views, but it's also a topic that you see in movies, and it's very dramatic, and so I think I found a real willingness to engage with this issue, and I've even talked to some people. I was hoping to have an opportunity to talk to more, but I talked to people involved in in the policy arena and some from previous administrations. And I found a real willingness on their part to think more critically and to evaluate new information. So I have some. I definitely recognize there are no easy solutions to this. I do think the current approach isn't working, though, and I do think there are opportunities to make it better, and I have some faith that can happen.
You also have a chapter on a man from the Treasury Department, and are we getting any closer to a consensus of any kind on kidnapping?
No, it's completely blown up. So, nobody is going to argue for the concessions consensus, right? So, we should have a global, agreement that will make concessions. But the effort by the U.S. government and the British government to create a global policy of no concessions, it failed. So actually, ironically, right before the Syria crisis happened, the U.S. and the British had some success. There was a UN resolution that basically called on all member states not to pay ransom to terrorist groups. This was a big step forward because at least rhetorically it stated that this was a bad thing. And then the Islamic State started kidnapping these groups of Europeans in Syria, and the Europeans, precisely because they had pledged, they had sort of ratified this UN resolution, basically affirming that they wouldn't do this, and then they went ahead and did it because they, the political reality in their countries was such that they couldn't say, well, we affirm this, this UN resolution, so we're not going to pay and we're going to let people die. Politically, that was impossible in Europe. So the consensus completely blew up, and there is no consensus. And I actually think that there shouldn't really be a consensus. I kind of think the ideal approach is something I call strategic ambiguity, where you don't really know. And I think it has to be acknowledged that every country in certain circumstances, the other exception, I talked about some of the exceptions. So the U.S. Will negotiate if American service personnel is taken as prisoner of war by the Taliban. So we know, some of you know Bo Bergdahl, who wandered off his base in Afghanistan. 5 prisoners were released from Guantanamo in exchange for him. If you were a civilian and you were taken hostage by the same group, no negotiation, doesn't happen. So there are so many exceptions. We also routinely negotiate with rogue states that imprison Americans unjustly. Jason Rezaian, some of you may know, the Washington Post reporter. He's got an amazing new book out, which
I do, and it is amazing.
It really is great, and I love Jason. And the reason he's home is because the State Department, was able to engage in some creative resolution. Some Iranians who were imprisoned in the United States for sanctions violations were released as a result. So there are all sorts of circumstances in which the U.S. negotiates, and if we're confused, even the kidnappers are confused, because they're like, well, and I actually talked to some of the Americans, not the Americans didn't survive, but the European hostages who were held with the Americans, and the Islamic State kidnappers would actually say, look, Bo Bergdahl was released, and they know that ransom was paid in some circumstances, and they know that there's this kidnapping. So they, in some ways, they kind of, on the one hand, they did believe that they weren't going to get paid, and that's why they eventually killed them. Partly there were other reasons as well, including strategic calculations that they had made. But they kept taunting the hostages about what they claimed was inconsistencies in the policy, and the reality is, of course, it is really inconsistent, and it is really confusing because there's this one carve out. And in every other circumstances, we negotiate, we're pragmatic, we look for solutions, we apply this balancing test.
Yeah, I was going to say strategic ambiguity sounds like strategic inconsistency.
It's similar, but I just don't think there's any real advantage in tipping your hand. There are certainly circumstances where national security would preclude, would cause the government to say, look, there's no way that we can support the payment of ransom. I recognize that there may be circumstances like that. But look at each case individually. Don't apply this framework, because it's a designated terrorist group, and don't announce your intention, even if you're never going to pay. What's the point of announcing that? Because maybe if they think you might pay, there's a negotiation going on, you're gathering intelligence, you can launch a rescue. Maybe they escape. If they're alive and then negotiate. So I don't see any real reason, any real benefit. And I really think that each case is distinct, and that maximum flexibility, and there are creative strategies even within the existing legal framework, which I think would produce better outcomes.
As you mentioned, nobody's been prosecuted in this country, or these families haven't been prosecuted for trying to raise money for their loved one. Do we have a situation in which we could have a policy of allowing secret or private family negotiations?
Yeah, I mean,
in a way that wasn't so murky, shall we say?
Yeah, I mean, I think the kind of I sort of the last chapter I try and think practically. I mean, I think it doesn't come down to like duffel bags full of cash. It comes down to recognizing, look, the families are going to do what they can to pay, and instead of telling people who might want to contribute that they might be prosecuted, maybe there are ways in some circumstances for the government to provide assurances that they won't be prosecuted, privately. So, there are frameworks. It's just a question of, what is the role of the government in these circumstances? Is it to support the families who are going through these kinds of ordeals and looking for support and solutions, or is it to most fundamentally prevent the money that would go to the ransom to going to terrorist organizations which pose a security threat to the United States?
Indeed. I apologize. I was so absorbed by what Joel was saying, I forgot to watch the clock here. So is it time to go to Q&A?
Yeah, we'll open it up to audience Q&A, kind of shift the conversation to you. We'll take it in two forms. We'll have roving mics in the room. If you have a question, please raise your hand and wait to be called on. And then we also will be taking questions online at chi.cnf.io. We'll take a question just right here in the middle in the red sweater.
How come it's been policy of the United States, Israel, and Britain to not negotiate or pay ransom to terrorist organizations, where, as you mentioned, in Spain and France, they do that?
Well, that's really the fundamental. I mean, I think it comes down to a certain extent to politics. I think that because of the way political leaders in this country have positioned themselves in opposition to coercive threats from terrorist organizations, we don't negotiate is a political expression that resonates, and that's true in the UK as well. It doesn't work in France. It doesn't work in Spain. It's politically costly. I mean, I actually talked to some Spanish journalists who cover intelligence, and they're like, that is not a winning position. So it really comes down to, how do people within a society view the role of their government? What do they see as the kind of strategic threats? Does that kind of language, that kind of, sort of hardcore language resonate? Does it have a political meaning? And to a certain extent, I think that determines the policy rather than kind of an objective analysis of the cost benefit. And I think because it's such an emotional issue, it's very difficult to do that cost-benefit analysis, but that's actually the best way to formulate, the most productive policy.
It seems like a strong cultural component, too.
Yeah,
You mentioned that in France, they view the kidnapping of a Frenchman or French woman as a patriotic duty to get out of the streets.
Absolutely, and they believe that the government, has a responsibility to get them home.
Whereas here we're enemies of the state. But
yeah, I don't think Americans necessarily expect their government to do that. And governments that are perceived as being firm in response to this kind of threat, even if it's costly in terms of American lives, that's a perceived political benefit.
We'll take a question just right over there, just right next to you. Mm-hmm.
Hi, I wonder whether you have any thoughts about the responsibility of the press in these circumstances.
Absolutely, I've got some thoughts.
And did you? Oh, good, good. About whether we should print the fact that there is a kidnapping,
Yeah.
or not?
Yeah. Well, again, it's case by case, and that's the most important principle. Like to be confined by some policy and that try to apply it in every circumstance is wrong. But let me try and talk through the variables, and this is based on experience. So let's just say there are 3 ways of responding to a kidnapping. One is sometimes called a media blackout, and that is when. And I have a lot of issues with that. It's basically when a journalist, most of the time a journalist, because if there's a special relationship that they have with the media, which I actually think presents its own questions about whether this kind of response would or consideration would be given to other people who aren't journalists. But there's across the board, there's just no coverage. The logic of this, the claim is that if there's no coverage, it's easier to carry out negotiations, coverage increases ransom demands, et cetera. But there are some very compelling counter-arguments which I find, which guide the way that I respond to this. First of all, in the immediate aftermath of a kidnapping, sometimes silence can be productive. There can be immediate negotiations, and news coverage can sometimes muck things up. But once that period is passed, I don't see a lot of evidence, and I've looked at a lot of cases, that blackouts lead to better outcomes. And they have some consequences. One is that people who should know about the increasing risk don't know about it, and so they're at risk. I've seen that happen specifically in Syria, because all those cases were blacked out. People didn't know about them, and they got kidnapped as a result. I also think it undermines public confidence in the media if they perceive the media as taking this, giving journalists a special consideration that they won't give to other people. So then the next kind of coverage is what I call just the facts coverage. So these are the facts, okay? In most cases, I think that's the best approach, because if these cases are suppressed and there's no coverage, you actually give this significant advantage in terms of communication to the kidnappers. They're the ones who can decide when to make it public, under what terms, and that gives them a tremendous advantage in terms of their ability to use these kidnappings to disseminate whatever they're looking to disseminate, their political demands, or some sort of terrorizing message. And then there's the third kind of coverage, which is what I call campaigning coverage, and that's when it's just ribbons and marches and there are and I'll tell you where campaigning coverage works. Campaigning coverage is very effective when you're dealing with governments. So if you're dealing with a government that's susceptible to public pressure, campaigning coverage can actually be effective. When you're dealing with a terror organization, it can actually be counterproductive. I'm sorry I'm introducing all these complexities, but this is the reality. And let me give you a very compelling example of that I lived personally that sort of caused me to rethink this. So when Daniel Pearl was kidnapped, the playbook back then was we're going to, mobilize the media, mobilize public sentiment in support of Daniel Pearl, because by doing so we can put pressure on the kidnappers, emphasize his humanity, try and isolate the kidnappers from their supporters, et cetera, et cetera. Well, he was kidnapped by Al-Qaeda. Their intention was to kill him. And so all that sort of high-profile media coverage actually dramatically increased the terrorizing value to them of that murder. And I always put it in these terms, most people can't name a single person who died in the Twin Towers or the Pentagon, but most people who lived through those years know that name, Danny Pearl. And so that inadvertently played into their hands. So it's a very complex issue, but my default is cover it, just the facts, kind of wire story. Don't blow it up, but don't suppress it either.
We'll take a question just right here. Lady in the white.
I'm curious to learn more about the technology component. There's so many advances, drones, analytics, geofencing, you name it.
Yeah.
How does this complicate or improve likelihood of negotiation success?
Yeah, well, it's technology has completely changed the whole equation. First of all, technology has changed the strategic value. Well, let's start with, first, technology has changed the risk profile, right? Remember, I was talking about, I always point this out. Al-Qaeda killed Danny Pearl, but Osama bin Laden, when he declared jihad against the United States, did it at a press conference. So I mean, bad guys have always sort of talked to the media because that was how they communicated, and technology has transformed the media landscape and made journalists less valuable and therefore more vulnerable. Technology has also increased dramatically the value of these terrorizing videos, because you can record them and disseminate them, and you could use your own production techniques and social media and all sorts of strategies to disseminate these terrorizing videos. So keeping these groups from having victims there's a national security imperative in achieving that result. So that's another. And the other thing is I found out that these terrorizing videos are a powerful recruitment tool. So you put out this horrible video and somebody says on social media glad to see this, and then they reach out to that person and say, oh, they try and recruit them. So they really are powerful tools for these groups. And then there's the other side of it, which is how has technology potentially made it more difficult for this crime to be carried out, because we have phones, and we have that can have tracking. So we have you can have small devices that track people. I mean, I have seen instances where people have been tracked as a result. I haven't seen that many instances where people, though, have been rescued. I mean, sometimes I've talked to security teams, and they're they know where the person is, they know where they're being held, but they're usually being held by a group of 14 people with a lot of weapons. So unless you're going in with a SWAT team, and even then, you're probably going to lose a bunch of people, and you may get the hostages killed. It doesn't really facilitate rescues, but it can facilitate negotiations. It can be valuable in terms of proof of life. It's much easier to do proof of life now. Remember the photographs of people holding the newspapers, and now it's usually somebody takes a photo, uploads it to an email, and sends it, and that and the negotiation with the hostage takers is much more fluid. Sometimes it even happens using these kinds of technologies.
We have time for just one more question right here, the gentleman right here in the gray button-up.
Hi there. So the way you described it, it seems like the way states make their decisions on whether or not to pay ransom is based solely on political fallout. In your opinion, what would be the best factors or even data points on doing a cost-benefit analysis on whether or not ransom should be paid?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's purely based on politics. I think politics is a significant consideration. I mean, there are also legitimate national security concerns, and there are legitimate, humanitarian concerns. So, I think the problem is trying to come up with some formula. That's what I resist. I mean, I think each case is different. The variables are so different. So, sometimes the kind of national security questions are just overriding. Sometimes the humanitarian considerations are overriding. But usually you're somewhere on that continuum. And, but there are certain things that I believe to be true. One is, whether, and so the argument about, not paying ransom keeps Americans safer. Again, it's not about, it's like supporting families when they feel they have no other alternative and they do this. There is really very little evidence to suggest that's true. What is true, as I mentioned, is that the money that goes to paying ransom does finance terror organizations. That's a really legitimate concern, and that's more complex. But I don't think that the policy that we have of no concessions is achieving, if we define the results as we want to bring Americans home, wherever that's possible, we want them to come home. We don't want them to die. We want to keep them safe. We want to reduce the likelihood that they'll be kidnapped. And we want to prevent terror organizations that threaten our national security from having the resources they need to do that. If that's the objective of, that we as a nation want to achieve, then I don't think our current policy is getting the job done.
That brings us to the conclusion of our program. Joel's book will be available for purchase and signing. We want to negotiate. Please join me in thanking both Clarence Page and Joel Simon.
Thank you, Clarence. That was great.